So let's talk about the this so-called opening of Japan. Uh, it was, I believe, not the only cause of the collapse of the Tokugawa, but this opening of Japan was certainly the trigger, which combined with all of the other structural problems the Tokugawa were facing, and kind of made this collapse inevitable. And it was triggered, the opening of Japan was, by the arrival of two missions. The first, and oftentimes regarded as the more important one, the first to arrive, was an American mission led by Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy, who had orders from President Millard Fillmore to open Japan, to basically to establish a supply station in Japan so that American ships could go to China. This essentially meant establishing diplomatic relations with Japan. And the second mission was one that was sent out from Russia. As soon as the Russians heard the Americans were sending a mission, they wanted to send one too, so that any concessions the Tokugawa gave to the Americans, they'd also have to give to the Russians. And this mission arrived also in 1853, but a little bit later, and it was led by Admiral Yefimий Putyatin of the Russian Navy. And both of these were powerful modern squadrons, including which included steamships. Which is something that apparently terrified Japanese observers, especially the American fleet. The American fleet was the larger, and Perry had an aggressive personality. So what he did was in 1853, he sailed into Edo Bay, brazenly doing this, despite being told to not do this by samurai who approached the ships. He didn't care. He sailed into Edo Bay, and in an imperious manner, he demanded that the Tokugawa establish, basically accept letters of introduction from the president, diplomatic letters, and essentially establish diplomatic relations with the United States. In effect, allowing a coaling station and the presence of a diplomatic representative in Japan would be tantamount to establishing diplomatic relations. So Perry demands this in 1853, says, I'm going to leave and I'll come back next year, and by next year you'd better give me the response that I want. He does threaten to use force. He's very clear about this. And he basically learned a lesson from the earlier Biddle mission. The lesson he claimed to have learned was you have to treat Japanese with firmness or else they're going to walk all over you. And he was certainly not about to be intimidated. And in the Bakufu, there was great confusion. Nobody was really sure what to do. If you give in to his demands, you look weak. If you threaten to oppose him, he very well might start shooting, and then you're going to look weak because you are weak. The Putyatin mission, in the meantime, had arrived, enters into Nagasaki first, and basically demands that the Japanese that the Tokugawa open Japanese ports for Russian ships, and demands trade, and also wants to finally, once and for all, settle the borders in the north, but in all other respects, basically demands that which the Americans are also demanding. And Putyatin leaves and comes back to Japan several times between 1853 and 1855, shows up in different places at different times. But basically he always also says, I'll be back, and when I come back, you'd better give me the answer that I'm looking for, because even though I like you, that crazy American guy, that Perry, he's really serious, and you don't want to piss us off. It's basically a way of making a threat without seeming like you're making a threat. So these Westerners were clearly running different missions than their predecessors had before them. They were much more powerful, and the Tokugawa were in a much weaker position to deal with them this time. So they have no choice, and they have to sign a treaty which becomes known as the Convention of Kanagawa with Perry. And this treaty has 12 clauses, the most important ones of which I've outlined in bold. Shimoda and Hakodate are opened to American ships. Two ports, one close to Tokyo but still over a mountain range and pretty isolated, close to Edo. That's Shimoda. Hakodate, the port in Matsumai domain up in Ezo, both places that are meant to be basically you can't easily get to Edo from either one of these ports. Nagasaki was also opened later. So opening of ports, very important. The permission of trade and the establishment of currency exchanges, which basically plugged Japan into the international economy, at least that part of it which was dominated by Westerners. Article 9, the most favored nation clause. Basically what this says is that whatever concessions any other countries get from the Tokugawa are also automatically extended to the Americans. This was a very common way that European imperialists were operating across the world. They competed with each other, but in the end they kind of collaborated in order to more effectively dismember the societies with which they came into contact. So that's Article 9, and Article 11, also very important, the opening of an American consulate at Shimoda. This was the appointment of a permanent American diplomatic representative in Japan, and the ancestral law was more or less dead as far as American-Japanese relations were concerned. Basically, the Tokugawa had signed this treaty because they had come to believe they had no choice. In 1853, after Perry had left for the first time, the Tokugawa took a really unprecedented step. They polled the major daimyo. They asked them all the same question, which is, what do you recommend the Tokugawa do in this situation? And the results were really disappointing because nobody agreed. Many of the daimyo said, let's fight. Many of the daimyo said, let's give in. Many of the daimyo said, let's pretend to give in and then fight, or let's give in for a few years, establish trade, learn from the Americans, and then use their own weapons against them. And some basically said, we have no idea what to do either. So the Tokugawa didn't get any useful replies, and they also made themselves look weak, because for the first time ever, the Tokugawa were asking their own retainers what they should do in the foreign relations arena. They were in effect giving up their monopoly on setting the parameters for foreign relations. They'd lost control in that important respect. So the chief Roju, a man at the time named Abe Masahiro, basically signed the treaty of the Convention of Kanagawa with the Americans in 1854, and then the following year, in 1855, he signed the Treaty of Shimoda, a similar treaty with the Russians, but one which is interesting enough so that we should look at it in detail as well. The Treaty of Shimoda was indeed similar to the Convention of Kanagawa, with the following differences. First of all, actually, let's start from number 2. Shimoda, Hakodate, and Nagasaki were all open to Russian vessels. 3 ports instead of 2, and then the Americans also got the use of Nagasaki because of that most favored nation clause. Also, the Treaty of Shimoda established mutual extraterritoriality for the citizens of Russia and Japan. So this meant that if a Russian was to commit some kind of a crime in Japan, he would not be prosecuted by Japanese authorities. He would be handed over to the Russians and they would prosecute their own. But this treaty said that Japanese in Russia who commit crimes would be handed over to Japanese authorities as well. It's very interesting because all of the other imperial powers who signed treaties with Japan after this, they made it clear that extraterritoriality only worked to the advantage of the Europeans. That is, the Europeans would in many cases not be punished for crimes they committed in Japan because they'd be handed over to European authorities. The Russians also, I mean, there's no evidence that this mutual extraterritoriality had any effect, whereas Russians living in Japan, especially sailors, oftentimes did cause a lot of trouble and didn't themselves get into trouble. These extraterritoriality clauses actually became a great point of grievance with many Japanese who referred to the treaties signed in the 1850s as the unequal treaties. And this issue of foreigners not being punished for committing crimes on Japanese soil was seen as a great injustice. But it's interesting that the Treaty of Shimoda suggested possibly a different way to go. And most importantly was, number one on this list, the boundary between Japan and Russia was firmly drawn once and for all. Not really, but people thought it had been. At least they had achieved a agreement, whereas they had not achieved an official agreement before. Basically from the conclusion of the Golovnin incident until the signing of this treaty, there had been a stable border between Russia and Japanese-controlled Ezo, passing by here in between Etorofu and Urup. But this was an unofficial border. It was stable, neither side challenged it, but it was unofficial. And from the early 1850s, actually from 1853, Russian and Japanese settlers and military garrisons were actually competing for control over Sakhalin, which is called Karavto in Japanese. So there was a real conflict going on here, and something had to be done about that. So what the Japanese and Russian negotiators finally agreed to in the town of Shimoda, one of those towns that was opened to foreign ships, they agreed to set the official border here in the Kuriles where it had already been in effect, and just to put off the issue of settling the border here. Sakhalin was supposed to be jointly administered. Nobody was really clear about that because they just didn't know how to solve that problem. They decided to put it off until 1875. There was another treaty reached then, and the borders were redrawn. But what is important, what is absolutely crucial for us to understand here, is the fact that a border had been drawn between Russia and Japan, which meant that Ezo had now been officially absorbed into Japan. Now we can think of Japan as having 4 main islands instead of 3. So really the Treaty of Shimoda was a monumentally important treaty in Japanese history. The Convention of Kanagawa had kind of forced open the door of relations with Western powers, and the Treaty of Shimoda had had pushed that door wider, if you will, but it had also settled the issue of what is going to happen with Ezo, and dramatically expanded the borders of Japan. This, of course, also changed in the minds of many Japanese people an idea of what it even meant to be Japanese. Now, your country really had a shape that was becoming more and more recognized by foreign powers, and as a result, subjects of the shogun began to kind of think about Japan in these ways, our country versus the outside world, and in many cases the outside world was dominated by Westerners and rather frightful, rather threatening, and then you have the delineation of borders, and you're moving slowly along the way towards constructing a modern Japanese identity in opposition to the outside world.